September 1st, 1939. If you were an American citizen, you likely would have been notified via newspaper that Germany just invaded Poland. The world was still shaking from the First World War, but with unresolved tensions in global politics, resource scarcity, economic hardship. What can best be described as critically unstable global conditions paved the way for the rise of fascist governments and subsequent breakout of brutal conflict. This period of time is rich with history. Undoubtedly, we could throw a dart at a board, and no matter what part of World War II history you want to talk about, there's a goldmine of social, cultural, economic, and/or technological history to discuss at great length. But we don't need darts, because we've got pins. Boom! How's that for a segue? This historic video series is brought to you by the Historic Autographs Company. You can find trading cards and relics related to the history explored here on our website. Link in the description. Our 1945 product is all about World War II, with a chance to pull servicemen autographs, DNA hair cards, uniform fabric, and more. Thanks for watching, and remember to like and subscribe for more content. Episode 4, World War II. World War II is a little harder to summarize than World War I, mostly owed to its scale. World War I was caused by the unexpected side effects of combining globalization and allyship in a rapidly changing post-industrial world. World War II was caused by World War I. It goes deeper than that, naturally, but the end of the First War left the globe in a pretty ubiquitous state of suffering. America did so well in the 20s, partially because they were barely damaged by the war compared to European nations that hosted the fighting, like France. But nations like Germany never really recovered, not until the rise of their totalitarian leader. But politics aside, there's the Allies and the Axis. Allies are America, Britain, France, Russia, China, etc., against the Axis, Germany, Italy, Japan, and a few others. Hitler and Mussolini were both fascist dictators who wanted expansion and control. The term Axis comes from Mussolini boldly claiming that the world would operate on a Rome-Berlin axis. Japan was also in it for expansion, with a desire to control the Pacific. They'd been fighting with China for some time already, and incurred the wrath of the US and UK when they attacked Pearl Harbor. The Allies put together a counteroffensive. American troops returned to Europe, where they would spend years fighting tooth and nail for territory. This war was a true sequel to the first. It was bigger, louder, and more brutal. The artillery was bigger, there were tanks and planes, constant bombings on either side blurred the lines between battlefield and civilian sector. Paratroopers, rapid-fire weaponry light enough to sling over a shoulder. Nowhere was safe. Conflict like that creates strong people. But for a second, put aside the war stories and the glory. It was tough out there. And wars being tough is why troop morale is such a critical focus in warfare. Call it human nature, but something was bound to emerge as a symbol of back home, of what the troops were fighting for. The US Army had measures for morale already. Think the stereotypical military stage shows put on at home base, card games, etc. Then there were large-scale efforts to hype up victories, propaganda for soldiers and civilians, all with the intent of making sure the war felt worth it. Pinups, meanwhile, were about to spring into existence, and it was because of a couple of factors. 1. As mentioned in Episode 2, pictures are easily transportable by soldiers who have to pack light. World War I proved their worth. 2. The US military was mostly male at the time, even more so if you're only looking at the troops that went overseas to fight and fly planes. It was a very masculine environment, with what we would describe to be femininity in general being a rare sight for soldiers, not to mention like colors other than green and brown. And 3, it was definitely in America's best interest to put resources towards morale. Fun fact, you know M&Ms? They, like countless other advances in technology, were made for the purpose of war. Soldiers wanted chocolate overseas, but it was hard to transport and carry in heat and sunlight. When M&Ms were made in America, they were bought exclusively by the government who provided them to soldiers. Well, in 1942, soldiers beset by the stark lack of women and femininity present on the front lines were generously provided with 9 million copies of Esquire Men's Magazine, which featured photographs and illustrations of women in raunchy outfits. They were very well received. This is what became the iconic pinup. The name was earned as soldiers would tear their favorite pages from the magazine and pin them to the walls of their barracks, or inside of their trunks. The term stuck, and the models would come to be known overarchingly as pinup girls. The other name for the art was, at the time, cheesecake, and if you've ever wondered where it came from, the term beefcake was the male equivalent of cheesecake. Pinup girls became a symbol of joy to stand against the grim reality of war. They represented the smiling faces back home that soldiers were fighting to protect, and in representing home, they started to act as a good luck charm to soldiers in certain situations. In some cases, soldiers would name pinup girls, if they weren't already named, and treat them like a protective entity. And if that sounds a little strange, it's just a defamiliarized way of saying they painted girls on planes for good luck. The renderings of women became akin to seals of protection. And it wasn't all men's magazines either. As their popularity grew, the art style spread, and the icon spread. The famous "We Can Do It" poster was drawn in 1943 to inspire women back home who were once again working in production and munitions and other jobs that sustained the war in the country. Rosie the Riveter was also a popular figure drawn in a similar art style. Pinups became explosive in their popularity, their own art movement, and they remained popular for the entire war. And in 1945, Hitler checks out. Germany surrenders, and Japan follows suit after America catapults the world into the nuclear era. The war is over, but we're not done. As was the case with the First World War, the cultural impacts would dramatically change society for decades to come in ways that are still relevant today, and certainly in more ways than we'll cover here. Most visibly in our case, pinups exist now. Magazines like Esquire and its rival Playboy start producing more of this wildly popular imagery, and the pinup art style merges with culture after the war to sell products and tell stories. Pinup girls were about to be everywhere for the next decade or so, which is a massive pivot from the decade prior. Going into World War II, there was a general belief in America that sexual content was corrosive and debasing, but now we're shipping men's magazines to soldiers by the millions. Not to say both sides of that opinion weren't present at the same time, but the power shifted. Pinups are also intrinsically tied to a certain concept of social order that was brought into being in American society because of the war. Because of both wars, perhaps. It's hard to be certain how exactly the concept came to be defined, but the American housewife was the product of this time period. That is, the image of 50s and 60s home life where the man of the house works while the wife keeps home and raises children and cooks meals. You know, the era of, "Honey, I'm home, what's for dinner?" Women being expected to selflessly play a support role to their hardworking husband is sadly an oft-repeated concept, but it took on a new shape in the 50s and 60s, with an image that we still recognize today. This is just speculation, but it could have been the result of having 2 world wars fought entirely by men. War left scars that didn't heal. Men returning home had to start families and had no way to deal with the things they saw and felt and did. Therapy was a new concept and not widespread. Men also were generally discouraged from talking about the horrors of war, as doing so would be counter to the heroic representations of soldiers in media and propaganda. That, combined with the national pride for those who served and potential emotional turmoil of returning soldiers, might have fostered the line of thinking that the comparatively unburdened women should look after the men. Then that line of thinking was reinforced with products and media, the most famous example of which was June Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver, a television show that started in 1957. June Cleaver was always perfectly dressed and made up. She kept the house spotless, and she was devoted selflessly to her family. Her hobbies were ladylike, cake decoration, and embroidery. June Cleaver would go on to become the face of the 50s and 60s housewife, and a standard that many wives were compared to. But that's a bit ahead of where we are right now. This video is getting long, and we've really only just broken into the effects that pinup have on society. Now we know where they came from, and we can dive into where they went from there. As America heads towards the shining post-wars 50s and 60s, we'll see how the war pushes the conceptualization of the American housewife, how that brings about second-wave feminism, and how America's collective views of sexuality and the marketing thereof change era by era. Keep an eye out for our next video.